Hi everybody, Mr. Cohn here with another video for you guys to watch. Today's topic is going to be about eras in foreign policy, in American foreign policy that is, which is our fifth learning target. There's a lot of information that we're about to cover, and I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. So feel free to pause and stop and write things down on your sheets as needed. You really just need to be focusing on what are the specific interests or goals that seems to be driving American foreign policy. And make sure you capture those key actions and those key vocabulary. Please don't try to write down everything, just get the main concepts. Otherwise, you're going to be spending lots of time watching this video. Let's get started. What you need to understand about World War II was that just before that, after we fought World War I, we decided to follow this idea called isolationism. This is where we decide to stay out of everything, as you might remember from our relationships between countries, um, activities. The idea here is that we didn't want anything to do with anybody. We kind of wanted to grow our own economy, work on our own stuff, not get involved. And so we decided it was best to stay out of everything until World War II. When World War II came along, we didn't fight initially, but we did start providing military aid for our former allies in England and France. So slowly but surely, we started to give more military aid. First, it was just a little bit of money, then it started becoming weaponry and tanks and things like that. Before you knew it, we joined. How did we join? Well, President FDR wanted to show his support in order to protect the basic rights and freedoms around the world. So think about ideology here. We're looking to protect freedoms and basic rights. There were countries that weren't allowing those things. We decided that we want to help, but we didn't really feel like it was our place to get involved. Remember, we have been isolationists for several years now. It wasn't until Pearl Harbor, which we just celebrated the anniversary of, um, that's when we decided to join. When there was an attack on American soil, we decided, okay, it now met both our security and our ideological interests. It was time for us to join. We fought alongside the Allied powers, Russia, England, and France. And together we defeated the Axis powers, Germany and Japan. And so this became a pretty much a one-sided affair after a while, and especially after we used the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And that essentially forced Japan to surrender, and that was the end of the war in August of 1945. Germany had surrendered in May of that same year. After the war, the United States decided to become a leader of the Allied powers in creating a United Nations. This was the second time that the world had tried to create an international organization dedicated to peace. We're going to be looking a little bit more at the United Nations tomorrow, but for now, you should have a little bit of an idea about them. Plus, you should really understand that the United States was paramount in its creation. So a lot of political power here being shown by the U.S. During the Cold War, which lasted about 45 years, ironically enough, there was never actually physical war of any kind. It was more of about ideological differences between the Soviets, aka Russia, and the communism that they believed in, and the United States and the democracy and capitalism that they believed in. So this was a huge conflict right after World War II, believe it or not, between who once were allies, realized that their ideologies were just too different and they could not get along. So during this period of time, this Cold War, the U.S. foreign policy focused on this idea of containment, meaning that they wanted to try and prevent the spread of communism as an economic ideology, meaning they didn't want other countries starting to adopt their economies towards communism. They felt that if they can contain it in one area, aka the Soviet Union, it would be able to prevent it from growing everywhere. Because the US felt that if that were to spread, they were worried about this idea called a domino theory, as you can see in this image here. If one country got it, then another, then another, and another, and another, and eventually the whole world would be taken over by communism. Now, this was not really realistic, but that's what the US feared. And so because of this, there was a lot of public panic about communism, or the Reds, and a lot of government fear about other countries adopting this. So they really focus on this idea of containment. Another thing after World War II, the U.S. decided to provide lots of economic aid to the countries in Europe that were torn up by the war. This was known as the Marshall Plan. You can see here how much money they gave to different countries, and the idea was if they helped us if we help them rebuild, they were not going to adopt communism. Oh, look, the US is giving us money. We should believe in them. We should do those things to help keep the Russians out of those areas and try to influence them with communism. Again, a competing ideology is what's happening here between the Soviets and the US. Also, the Truman Doctrine provided military aid to different governments to help them fight against communism. So not only did the US provide economic aid to try to help these countries grow after the war, they also were trying to give them military aid to any country that was close by to Russia, or that the country Russia was showing some interest in them, anything like this, especially Turkey, for example, and Greece. They were trying to use different kinds of aid to keep communism out of those countries. I talked about the political power with the UN. The US was also instrumental in creating a military alliance known as NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This included many Western European nations, Canada, and the US. They were committed to defending one another. The idea was that, while they never said it out loud, was in case one of them gets attacked by the Russians for communist purposes, then the other ones would go and back them up. Later on, Russia created their own alliance with some of the other countries in the East that were more favorable towards communism. Also, during the Cold War, both the US and the communists tried to sort of a show of arms, developing as much nuclear technology as they could. This was known as nuclear proliferation, meaning the growing and development of your nuclear weapons. Now, we came close in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but no nuclear war was ever launched by either side against the other. But it only managed to strike more fear and heighten more conflict and tension between these two sides. So as you can see, there's lots of different things going on here as the US and the Soviets are trying to fight for ideological power in the world. And I just talked about this idea here, that neither really wanted to attack, because if they did, it would turn into mutually assured destruction, meaning both sides were guaranteed to blow up and die. Essentially, if one of them decided to launch a nuclear attack against the other, the whole world was probably going to end. So luckily, neither of them decided to do that. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't be here today. Now, there were ways in which they fought head to head. These were called proxy wars, meaning it wasn't US troops versus Soviet troops. They would go into other, like, civil war conflicts going on in different countries. Korea, for example, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, places like that. And each one would take a side, and they'd sort of be a puppet and a puppet master and sort of fight for their ideologies through the civilians there. And so they provided lots of military aid, cash, weapons, lots of these things to help sort of the different groups there fight for their ideologies. But again, it was never really them who fought this. That's why it's called a proxy war. Korean War, as I mentioned, Vietnam, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as well in the late 70s. All three of these are considered proxy wars. Now, let's get closer to today. Post-Cold War, 1990 and 2001. When the USSR collapsed, the international community really entered a new era where there was hope for maybe we can start to come together and, bond and be able to mutually defend each other, promote democracy, promote human rights. The US was the only lasting superpower after this, so they really took a leading role in promoting some of these ideologies across the world, as you might imagine. There was the first Gulf War, where the U.S. and a UN-approved mission went to go liberate some areas in the Middle East, in Kuwait, because Iraq had invaded and tried to take over and force different things upon them. And the success of this really made the U.S. and the UN look especially strong, because it made them look like they were able to promote global peace and security and really effectively work together to bring about the kinds of change that people wanted to see in the world. But the U.S. failed in other places, especially with some of the UN humanitarian aid, like in Somalia. This is the movie Black Hawk Down. We'll talk more about this in Unit 6, but for now, just understand that they weren't always successful, the UN and the U.S. that is, in accomplishing everything that they had hoped, especially with some of their aid. A lot of countries weren't accepting of it, and it really made things difficult, and there were several failures going on. 9/11, for example, when the Twin Towers collapsed in New York, a lot of our security interests became the forefront of what we cared about. Preventing more future attacks, keeping Americans safe, this became the highest priority in America. It's what launched us into a lot of wars against Al Qaeda, Taliban, even ISIS now, the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, and a lot of NATO missions with the U.S. military were conducted as a name of security interest to try and capture Osama bin Laden and to bring terrorists to justice for the variety of things that they had done. And they've continued their presence in the Middle East to this day, as you know. Bush created what's known as the Bush Doctrine, that the U.S. would act proactively, meaning before any actual terrorist attack were going to happen, they were going to be able to act to prevent future terrorist attacks. Rather than being on the defensive, the U.S. could act unilaterally, meaning on their own, if they really wanted to. And perhaps the worst of them all, the U.S. could violate certain rights as necessary to keep Americans safe. These kinds of changes that we saw with government policy in the U.S. was a big part of our security interests, our fear of these terrorist groups attacking on our soil again. More information here about the Iraqi war and the invasion of Saddam Hussein. You're welcome to pause and read this on your own time. More U.S. and allies work on invasions with the support of the UN Security Council. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And more things that were done here. You can read about that. Guantanamo Bay, terrorists being held there. You can read about this as well. Drones, we know about drone use now, and the U.S. using drones to try and carry out attacks on terrorists to minimize the amount of troops that have to be there. And Obama continues many of his policies in the war on terror. Now, while he shut down some of the wars, there's still plenty of presence in the Middle East, especially in Afghanistan. We're seeing heightened presence and actions because of Syria and the civil war there and because of ISIS. Libya is another example. You can look this up on your own time. And we talked about Syria just a moment ago. You can pause the video to check these out on your own time. And that's really it. So hopefully you've been able to get a good sense of what are some of the major interests at play at all these different eras of foreign policy for the United States. Hopefully you've been able to get some of the key actions and specific policies. And again, while I did go through this pretty quickly, you are always able to pause at any point to go back and look and read and check it out. So make sure that you have all these basics down for understanding American foreign policy over the last 100 years, and we'll talk more about it tomorrow. See you guys then.